I pulled into my parents' driveway on that crisp November afternoon, clutching the steering wheel tighter than usual. The two-story colonial house looked exactly the same as always, with its faded blue shutters and Mom's withered flower boxes. But everything felt different now. I had a secret burning in my chest, one that had been eating at me for 3 months. $10 million sat quietly in my bank account, and I planned to keep it that way, at least for today. I grabbed my purse and headed toward the front door, where the smell of turkey and my sister Jessica's loud laughter drifted through the autumn air. The moment I stepped inside, Jessica rushed over to hug me, her blonde curls bouncing as she practically tackled me in the entryway. She always had this way of making everything about her even simple greetings. As she squeezed me tight, her hand bumped against my purse, and she immediately pulled back with that mischievous grin I knew too well. "May, honey, do you have any lip balm?" "Mine dried out in the car and my lips are absolutely cracked," she said, already reaching for my purse before I could respond. "Jessica, wait. I can get it for you." I started to protest, but she was already digging through my bag with the enthusiasm of a treasure hunter. My heart stopped as I watched her fingers rifle through my belongings. I'd forgotten about the bank statements I'd printed yesterday, the ones I'd been carrying around, trying to figure out what to do with this unexpected windfall. Time seemed to move in slow motion as Jessica's manicured fingernails found the folded papers. Her face changed completely as she unfolded the first statement. Her eyes widened, scanning the numbers, and then her mouth dropped open in a way that would have been comical if I wasn't frozen in absolute terror. $10 million. She shrieked at the top of her lungs, her voice carrying through every corner of the house. "May has $10 million. The sound of footsteps thundered from every direction. Dad came running from the living room with Uncle Frank close behind. Mom rushed out of the kitchen, still wearing her turkey-stained apron. Cousin Blake appeared from upstairs, and Aunt Dorothy emerged from the dining room where she'd been setting the table. Within seconds, I was surrounded by my entire extended family, all staring at the crumpled bank statements in Jessica's trembling hands. The entryway felt like it was shrinking around me as their shocked expressions turned into something else entirely, something hungry and calculating. "How is this possible?" Mom whispered, snatching the papers from Jessica to examine them herself. "This has to be some kind of mistake," Dad said, but his voice carried a tone I'd never heard before. Suspicious, demanding. Jessica's initial shock melted away, replaced by indignation that seemed to radiate from every fiber of her being. "May, you've been hiding this from us, from your own family." I can explain," I stammered, but Jessica cut me off with a wave of her hand. "Explain what's to explain. You have $10 million and you didn't think to mention it, not even to me." Her voice rose with each word. "Do you have any idea what I could do with that money? What Emma could do? She needs college funds, May. She needs opportunities." Uncle Frank stepped closer, his usually gentle demeanor replaced by something much more aggressive. $10 million, May. That's more money than most people see in a lifetime. "This isn't right," Aunt Dorothy chimed in, shaking her head disapprovingly. "Family doesn't keep secrets like this from family." Cousin Blake pulled out his phone, probably calculating his own debts in real time. "May, I don't think you understand how much the rest of us are struggling right now." The walls seemed to close in as their voices grew louder and more demanding. I could hear the turkey timer going off in the kitchen, but nobody moved to check on it. The Thanksgiving dinner we'd all been looking forward to was forgotten as my family formed a circle around me, their eyes fixed on those damning bank statements. "Jessica deserves this money more than you do," Mom said quietly, but with such conviction that it hit me like a physical blow. "She has children to think about, responsibilities you don't have. I can't believe you were just going to sit there and eat turkey while hoarding $10 million. Jessica continued, her face flushed with anger and something that looked like betrayal. What kind of person does that to their own sister? The accusations came faster now, overlapping and building into a crescendo of family judgment that made my head spin. This wasn't how I'd imagined telling them. This wasn't how any of this was supposed to happen. The living room had been transformed into something resembling a courtroom, with me seated in Dad's old leather recliner, while the rest of my family arranged themselves in a perfect semicircle around me. The afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows felt harsh and unforgiving, highlighting every disappointed expression on their faces. Jessica stood at the center of their formation like a prosecutor preparing to deliver an opening statement. She'd smoothed her hair and composed herself, but I could see the fire still burning behind her eyes. The bank statements lay spread across the coffee table like evidence in a criminal trial. Before we go any further, Mom announced with the authority of a judge, I think everyone needs to remember what we agreed on as a family many years ago. She disappeared into the hallway and returned with a wooden box I remembered from childhood. My stomach sank as she lifted the lid and pulled out a folded piece of construction paper, yellowed with age and covered in crayon marks. The family constitution, she said solemnly, unfolding it with reverence, usually reserved for historical documents. We wrote this together when you girls were little, and it clearly states that any significant financial windfalls must be shared equally among all family members. I stared at the paper in disbelief. I remembered that afternoon 20 years ago when we'd been playing family games during a rainy weekend. Jessica and I had been maybe 8 and 10 years old, scribbling silly rules about sharing toys and taking turns choosing television shows. The idea that this childhood activity could somehow be legally binding was absurd, but the expressions on everyone's faces suggested they were taking it very seriously indeed. Mom, that's not a real legal document, I said weakly. We were children playing pretend. A promise is a promise. Dad replied, his voice carrying a sternness I'd rarely heard directed at me. Usually he saved that tone for telemarketers and door-to-door salespeople, not his own daughters. Your mother and I witnessed those signatures. We all agreed that family comes first, always. Jessica nodded emphatically, pointing to her childish scrawl at the bottom of the paper. See, I signed it. You signed it. We promised to share everything important. Uncle Frank leaned forward in his chair, clasping his hands together in what I recognized as his serious conversation posture. May, sweetheart, I think you need to understand the position this puts the rest of us in. Here we are struggling with mortgages and medical bills and student loans, while you're sitting on enough money to solve everyone's problems. Frank's restaurant failed last year. Aunt Dorothy added, her voice thick with emotion. He lost everything he worked for his entire life. The medical bills from my heart surgery are still coming in. We're talking about selling the family cabin just to stay afloat. Cousin Blake shifted uncomfortably in his chair, then pulled out his phone to show me a photo of his wife in a hospital bed. Linda's cancer treatments aren't fully covered by insurance. We've maxed out every credit card we have. Some nights I lie awake wondering if we're going to lose the house. The weight of their financial struggles pressed down on me like a physical force. These weren't strangers asking for handouts. These were the people who'd celebrated my birthdays, taught me how to drive, helped me move into my first apartment. The guilt was overwhelming, but something deep in my chest resisted their demands. I understand that everyone's going through difficult times. I began carefully. But this money isn't just sitting around waiting to be distributed. There are complicated circumstances surrounding how I got it. Circumstances? Jessica scoffed, throwing her hands up in exasperation. Money is money, May. It doesn't matter where it came from. What matters is what you do with it now that you have it. Mom dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, and I realized she was actually crying. Real tears over money that didn't belong to her, money she'd never earned or expected. I raised you to be generous, May. I taught you to put family first. This is your chance to prove that those lessons meant something. Remember when you needed $500 for textbooks in college? Uncle Frank asked, his voice taking on the tone of someone calling in a long overdue favor. I didn't hesitate to help you then. I didn't ask questions or demand explanations. I just wrote the check because that's what family does for each other. The memories he referenced felt like weapons being used against me. Every birthday gift, Every helping hand, every moment of family support was being reframed as an investment that was now due for collection. The love I'd always felt from these people was beginning to feel conditional, contingent on my willingness to share this unexpected windfall. "You were always the lucky one," Aunt Dorothy said with a bitter edge to her voice. "Good grades came easy to you. You got that scholarship to college. You landed that high-paying job right out of school. And now this, $10 million just falls into your lap while the rest of us can barely keep our heads above water." From the kitchen, I could hear Grandma Ruth moving around, probably checking on the turkey that everyone had forgotten about. Her absence from this confrontation felt significant, though I couldn't quite understand why yet. Jessica moved closer to my chair, crouching down so we were at eye level. "May, I'm your sister. I'm not asking you to give me everything, but Emma is only 8 years old and she deserves the same opportunities you had. She's smart just like you were. But if I can't afford to send her to a good college, if I can't give her music lessons and tutoring and all the things that helped you succeed, then what kind of future does she have?" The mention of Emma hit me harder than anything else they'd said. My niece was brilliant and curious, always asking questions about my work and showing me the stories she wrote in her little notebooks. The idea that she might not have the same chances I'd had was genuinely heartbreaking. "And what about my student loans?" Jessica continued, her voice growing more urgent. "I'm still paying for a master's degree I got 10 years ago. Every month, $600 goes to loan payments instead of Emma's savings account. You could wipe that out with what amounts to pocket change for you now." Dad stood up and began pacing the small space behind the couch, his hands clasped behind his back in what I recognized as his problem-solving stance. "Let's be practical here. $10 million is far more than any single person needs. Even if you kept half May, that would still leave $5 million to help the people who love you most." $5 million. Blake said, hopefully probably doing quick mental math about his medical bills. "Split among all of us, that would be life-changing money." Uncle Frank agreed. Not just helpful, but actually life-changing. Mom folded the construction paper constitution carefully and placed it back in its box as if she'd just presented the decisive evidence in their case. The question isn't whether you can afford to share May. The question is whether you want to be the kind of person who hoards wealth while her family struggles. The late afternoon sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the living room. The house felt different now, charged with an energy I'd never experienced here before. This was supposed to be a place of comfort and unconditional love, but it had transformed into something else entirely. A place where love came with price tags and expectations, where family bonds were measured in dollars and cents. From the kitchen came the sound of Grandma Ruth humming quietly to herself, oblivious to the financial inquisition taking place in the next room. The contrast between her peaceful contentment and the aggressive demands surrounding me felt stark and telling. "So," Jessica said, standing up and smoothing down her sweater, "what's it going to be?" "May, are you going to do the right thing, or are you going to let greed destroy this family?" The emotional temperature in the room shifted as Jessica reached into her oversized purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper with the careful deliberation of someone playing their ace card. Her expression had transformed from angry to calculated, and I felt my stomach drop even before she began unfolding what I could see was a child's handwriting. "Before you make your final decision," Jessica announced, her voice taking on the practiced tone of someone who had rehearsed this moment, "I think you should see something that Emma wrote last week." She smoothed out the paper with theatrical care, revealing a letter written in purple crayon on lined school paper. The handwriting was careful and deliberate, the kind that comes from an 8-year-old who's been told this is very important. At the top of the page, Emma had drawn a picture of herself in a graduation cap, standing in front of a building labeled college. "Should I read it out loud?" Jessica asked, though she was already clearing her throat to begin. "Dear Aunt May, Mommy told me that you have special money that could help me go to college someday. I promise I will study very hard and make you proud. I want to be a scientist like you and help people. I already started a list of all the things I want to learn. Love, Emma. P.S. I drew you a picture of me graduating." The room fell completely silent except for the sound of Mom sniffling into her tissue. Jessica passed the letter around the circle, and I watched each family member's face soften as they read Emma's innocent words. Uncle Frank actually put his hand over his heart. Aunt Dorothy whispered something about how sweet children are when they still believe in dreams. "She doesn't understand the complexity of the situation," I said weakly, but my voice sounded hollow even to me. "What's complex about helping your niece get an education?" Dad asked, accepting the letter from Uncle Frank and studying it with the intensity of someone reviewing a contract. "Look at this, May. This child believes in you. She thinks you're going to help her achieve her dreams." Blake pulled out his phone and started showing everyone photos from Emma's last birthday party, scrolling through images of her blowing out candles and opening presents. "She's such a bright kid. You should hear her talk about wanting to study marine biology. She checks out library books about ocean science that are way above her grade level." "That's exactly what you were like at her age," Mom added with pointed emphasis. "Remember how you used to bring home all those science fair projects, how excited you'd get about your experiments? Emma has that same spark, but she needs someone to invest in her potential." Jessica moved to the mantelpiece and picked up a framed photo of Emma from last Christmas, holding it so everyone could see the gap-toothed smile and excited eyes. "She talks about you constantly, May. You're like a hero to her. She tells everyone at school about her aunt who works with computers and makes important things." The psychological pressure was becoming unbearable. They were weaponizing an 8-year-old's dreams and innocence, using her natural love and admiration against me in a way that felt both brilliant and deeply manipulative. "And it's not just Emma," Jessica continued, building momentum. "What about Tyler and Madison? They're getting older, starting to think about their futures too. Tyler wants to play baseball in college, but do you know how much travel teams and equipment cost? Madison is already showing signs of needing orthodontic work." Dad sat back down and pulled out a small notebook from his shirt pocket, the kind he used for household budgets and grocery lists. "Let me break down the numbers for everyone so we can see exactly what we're dealing with here." He clicked his pen and began writing, speaking each figure aloud as he jotted it down. Jessica's student loan, $62,000. Blake and Linda's medical debt, approximately $150,000. Frank's business recovery needs around $200,000. Dorothy's remaining medical bills, $35,000. Your mother and I could use about $100,000 for house repairs and retirement security. The clinical precision of his calculations made everything feel more real and more overwhelming. These weren't abstract requests for help. They were specific documented financial needs with actual dollar amounts attached. "That's less than $600,000 total," Dad concluded, looking up from his notebook with satisfaction. "Not even 6% of what you have, May. 6% to solve every major financial problem this family is facing." Mom stood up and walked to the window, gazing out at the darkening sky with her arms wrapped around herself. "I keep thinking about all the nights I've lain awake worrying about Jessica's situation. Single mother working 2 jobs trying to give those children everything they need. And all this time, the solution was sitting right there in your bank account." "2 jobs," Aunt Dorothy repeated sadly. "Can you imagine she works at the dentist's office during the day and cleans offices at night just to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads?" Blake nodded gravely. "Meanwhile, Linda can't work because of the chemotherapy. All our income is coming from my salary at the hardware store, and it's just not enough. We've had to choose between her medications and the mortgage payment more than once." The weight of their struggles was crushing, but there was something about the coordinated nature of their presentation that bothered me. The way Jessica had produced Emma's letter at exactly the right moment. The way Dad had those specific financial figures ready to go. The way each person's story built perfectly on the previous one. "How long have you all been planning this?" I asked quietly. "Planning what?" Jessica replied with practiced innocence. This intervention, this coordinated presentation of everyone's financial needs, the Constitution, Emma's letter, Dad's notebook full of exact figures. Mom turned back from the window with tears in her eyes that looked genuine, but her words carried a defensive edge. We're a family, May. We talk to each other about our problems. We support each other through difficult times, or at least we did until today. Uncle Frank shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Nobody planned anything, sweetheart. We're just sharing our honest situations with you. Is it wrong for a mother to prepare her daughter for important conversations? Jessica asked, clutching Emma's letter protectively against her chest. Is it wrong for me to hope that my sister might care enough about her niece's future to help when she has the means to do so? From the kitchen came the sound of the oven timer going off, followed by Grandma Ruth's voice calling out that the turkey was ready. But nobody moved toward the dining room. The Thanksgiving feast that had taken hours to prepare was growing cold while my family focused entirely on the money they believed they deserved. The turkey's ready, I said, grateful for any excuse to change the subject. The turkey can wait, Dad replied firmly. This conversation is more important than dinner. Much more important, Jessica agreed. We can reheat food, but we can't rebuild trust once it's broken. The threat was implicit but clear. Choose money over family and you'll lose us forever. Share the wealth and everything goes back to normal. The ultimatum hung in the air between us like smoke from a fire that was just beginning to spread. Blake looked at his phone and announced that it was already 6:30. Linda's expecting me to call and tell her how the conversation went. She's hoping we might finally be able to schedule her reconstructive surgery. And I promised Emma I'd bring her back some leftover pie, Jessica added. But I don't know how I'm going to look her in the eyes and explain that her college fund is still empty because her aunt chose to be selfish. The manipulation was becoming more obvious, but it was also becoming more effective. The image of disappointing Emma, of being responsible for dashing an 8-year-old's dreams, was almost unbearable. I need some time to think about all of this, I said finally. Think about what? Mom asked sharply. Think about whether you love your family enough to help them. Think about whether an 8-year-old girl deserves a chance at higher education. Think about whether you want to be known as the person who had the power to change lives and chose not to use it, Jessica added. The pressure was suffocating, but I stood my ground. I need time to process everything you've told me, to figure out the best way to handle this situation. Dad closed his notebook with a decisive snap. Some decisions don't require processing, May. Some decisions require heart, and right now I'm not sure your heart is in the right place. The emotional battering I'd been enduring for the past 2 hours had worn down my defenses completely. Their relentless pressure, Emma's innocent letter, the detailed financial breakdowns, the implications that I was heartless and selfish, had finally pushed me beyond my breaking point. I felt tears starting to flow down my cheeks as I realized I couldn't continue to protect them from the truth they clearly didn't want to hear. You want to know where the money came from? I said, my voice breaking with exhaustion and grief. You really want to understand why I can't just hand it over like it's some lottery prize I stumbled across? The room fell quiet, and for the first time all evening I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Even the sounds from the kitchen had stopped, as if Grandma Ruth was listening too. The money came from Robert Chen. I began wiping my eyes with the back of my hand. My mentor at the tech company, the man who taught me everything I know about software development, the person who believed in me when I was just a scared graduate student who didn't think she belonged in the tech world. Jessica shifted impatiently in her chair. Okay, so someone left you money in their will. That happens all the time. It doesn't change anything. He didn't just leave me money in his will. I continued, my voice growing stronger with anger. Robert died in a chemical explosion at our company 3 years ago. An explosion that happened because management cut corners on safety protocols to save money. An explosion that could have been prevented if they'd listened to the warnings Robert had been filing for months. The room's energy shifted slightly, but not in the way I'd expected. Instead of sympathy or understanding, I could see calculation in their eyes. They were processing this information not as a tragedy, but as additional context for why I should share the settlement money. Robert was 62 years old. I went on my hands trembling as I remembered that horrible day. He had no children, no close relatives. His wife had died 5 years earlier from cancer. I was the closest thing to family he had left, and he made me the beneficiary of his life insurance and savings. But that was only about $200,000. Dad leaned forward with interest. Then where did the other $9.8 million come from? From the lawsuit, I said quietly. The wrongful death lawsuit that took 2 years of my life to fight. 2 years of depositions and court appearances and reliving the worst day of my life over and over again. 2 years of battling corporate lawyers who tried to paint Robert as a careless employee who caused his own death. Uncle Frank nodded thoughtfully. Those corporate settlements can be substantial, especially when there's clear negligence involved. His clinical response to my trauma felt like a slap across the face. Clear negligence, I repeated. Frank, I watched security footage of Robert burning to death because the emergency shower system had been disconnected to save on water costs. I had to testify about finding pieces of his safety equipment scattered across the laboratory. I spent months going through his personal files documenting every safety concern he'd raised that management had ignored. Mom dabbed at her eyes, but her tears seemed perfunctory now, obligatory rather than genuine. That must have been very difficult for you, sweetheart. But Robert would probably want his money to help people who are suffering now, people who are alive and facing real problems. The casual dismissal of my grief was breathtaking in its cruelty. You think Robert would want his death money to pay for Jessica's credit card debt? You think he would want the settlement from his wrongful death lawsuit to go toward Uncle Frank's failed restaurant? I think, Jessica said with careful emphasis, that Robert would want you to be surrounded by family who love and support you. And right now, you're choosing money over the people who've been there for you your entire life. Blake nodded in agreement. Dead people can't benefit from money, May, but living people can. People with medical bills and mortgage payments and children who need educations. Besides, Aunt Dorothy added, you said yourself that you only knew him for 3 years. We've known you your entire life. We're the ones who raised you and shaped you into the person you are today. The reduction of my relationship with Robert to a simple mathematical equation of years was devastating. They couldn't understand that he'd been more than a mentor. He'd been the father figure I'd never had, the person who'd encouraged my dreams when everyone else thought I was reaching too high. Robert spent 3 years teaching me that I was capable of more than anyone in this room ever believed. I said, looking directly at Dad. He's the one who encouraged me to pursue advanced degrees. He's the one who recommended me for the job that gave me financial independence. He's the one who saw potential in me that my own family never recognized. That's not fair, Mom protested. We always supported your education. You supported my education when it was convenient and affordable, I shot back. But when I wanted to study computer science instead of elementary education, you told me it wasn't practical for women. When I wanted to pursue graduate school, you suggested I should focus on finding a husband instead. Robert was the first person who told me I could achieve anything I set my mind to. The uncomfortable silence that followed told me my words had hit their mark. They remembered those conversations, the subtle ways they'd tried to redirect my ambitions toward more traditionally feminine pursuits. Well, Jessica said finally, I think you're romanticizing this relationship. 3 years isn't very long, May. You're talking about him like he was your father or something. He was more of a father to me than anyone in this room has ever been, I replied, and I could see Dad flinch at the direct hit. Uncle Frank cleared his throat awkwardly. Look, May, we understand that you cared about this man, but dwelling on the past isn't going to solve anyone's current problems. The money exists now, regardless of how you got it. The question is what you're going to do with it. What I'm going to do with it, I said slowly, is honor Robert's memory by using it wisely, not by throwing it away on people who see it as free money instead of understanding what it really represents. Free money. Jessica's voice rose with indignation. You think family support is free money. You think helping your sister provide for her children is throwing money away. I said, standing up from the chair where I'd been trapped for over 2 hours, that this conversation is exactly why Robert warned me about what might happen if people found out about the settlement. He told me that money changes relationships, that people would start seeing me differently once they knew. Of course people are going to see you differently, Mom said with exasperation. You're sitting on $10 million while your family struggles. How are we supposed to see you the same way? You're supposed to see me as the same person I was this morning, I replied. The same person I was before Jessica went through my purse. The same daughter and sister who showed up here wanting to share Thanksgiving dinner with people I love. But you're not the same person, Dad said quietly. The person we thought we knew wouldn't keep secrets this big from her family. The person we thought we knew would have offered to help before we even had to ask. The judgment in his voice was final and devastating. In their eyes, I had already failed some fundamental test of character, simply by not volunteering to distribute Robert's settlement money the moment I received it. From the kitchen, I could hear Grandma Ruth moving around the sounds of aluminum foil being torn and containers being filled. She was preserving the Thanksgiving feast that none of us had eaten, saving it for a later time when appetites might return. The normalcy of those domestic sounds felt surreal against the backdrop of financial warfare being waged in the living room. I think, I said softly, that we should take a break from this conversation. The turkey's getting cold and we're all saying things we might regret later. The only thing I'm going to regret, Jessica replied coldly, is believing that my sister cared more about family than money. The atmosphere in the room had shifted from uncomfortable to downright hostile as Jessica's husband Mike appeared in the doorway, carrying a black leather briefcase. I hadn't even heard him come into the house, but his arrival felt orchestrated, like the entrance of a key player in a drama that had been carefully choreographed. Sorry, I'm late, Mike announced, setting the briefcase down on the coffee table with a decisive thud. Traffic from the office was brutal, but I managed to get everything prepared. His casual mention of having been at the office on Thanksgiving Day sent a chill down my spine. Mike worked as a paralegal at a small law firm downtown, and the fact that he'd spent the holiday preparing something in his briefcase couldn't be a coincidence. What's in there, Mike? I asked, though I was afraid I already knew the answer. He smiled with the practiced confidence of someone who'd spent years helping lawyers manipulate legal documents. Just some paperwork that might make this whole conversation easier for everyone. Jessica moved closer to her husband with obvious pride. Mike's been researching the legal aspects of family financial obligations. Turns out there are established precedents for this kind of situation. Mike opened the briefcase with theatrical flair, revealing several neat stacks of documents separated by colored tabs. The papers looked official and intimidating with legal letterheads and multiple signature lines highlighted in yellow. These are voluntary transfer agreements, Mike explained, pulling out the first stack and spreading them across the table. They're designed to facilitate family financial assistance in a way that's legally clear and binding. I picked up one of the documents, my hands shaking as I scanned the dense legal language. The numbers jumped out at me like assault weapons: $4 million to Jessica and Mike, $2 million to my parents, and the remaining $4 million split among Uncle Frank, Aunt Dorothy, and Blake, according to a complex formula that somehow accounted for family relationship proximity and financial need. You've already calculated exactly how you want to divide my inheritance, I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Our inheritance, Dad corrected firmly. Remember the family constitution. Mike nodded enthusiastically. Exactly. These documents simply formalize what should happen naturally within a close-knit family unit. They protect everyone involved and ensure that the transfers happen smoothly. Protect everyone from what I demanded. From future disagreements, Uncle Frank said. From misunderstandings about who gets what and when. This way everything is clear and documented. Jessica pointed to specific lines in the contract with the expertise of someone who'd reviewed these documents multiple times. See here. It says the transfers will be completed within 30 days of signing. No delays, no changing your mind, no backing out once you've committed to doing the right thing. The 30-day deadline felt like a noose tightening around my neck. And what if I refused to sign? Mike's smile faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. Well, that would be unfortunate for everyone involved. These documents represent a good faith effort to resolve this situation amicably within the family. What does that mean exactly? I pressed. Blake shifted uncomfortably in his chair and avoided making eye contact. It means we'd have to explore other options. Legal options. Legal options for what it's my money. Actually, Mike said, pulling out another set of documents, that's not entirely clear. When someone receives a large sum of money and then fails to assist family members in documented financial distress, it can raise questions about their mental competency and decision-making capacity. The threat was delivered in such casual professional language that it took me a moment to fully process what he was saying. Are you threatening to have me declared mentally incompetent? Not threatening, Mom said quickly, just exploring all available options to protect the family's interests. Aunt Dorothy leaned forward with what she probably thought was a reassuring smile. Honey, we're not trying to hurt you. We're trying to help you make the right decision before you do something you'll regret forever. Something like keeping my own inheritance. Something like destroying this family over money, Jessica said sharply. Something like choosing greed over the people who love you most. Mike produced yet another document from his apparently bottomless briefcase. This is information about conservatorship proceedings. Sometimes when people come into large amounts of money, suddenly they need guidance to manage it responsibly. Conservatorship. I repeated, feeling like I'd stepped into some alternate universe where my family was discussing taking control of my finances as casually as they might debate what television show to watch. It's a last resort, Dad said, but his tone suggested he'd given this option serious consideration. Something we'd only pursue if you proved incapable of making sound financial decisions. Sound financial decisions like giving away 90% of my inheritance to people who think they deserve it. Sound financial decisions like recognizing your moral obligations to the people who raised you and supported you throughout your life, Mom replied with finality. Blake pulled out his phone and began scrolling through what appeared to be a lengthy document. I've been researching similar cases online. There are actually several precedents for families challenging inheritance distributions when the beneficiary refuses to share with relatives in need. You've all been researching this? I asked, looking around the room at faces I'd known and loved my entire life. How long have you known about the money? The silence that followed was more revealing than any answer could have been. They exchanged glances with the guilty expressions of children caught in a lie. We suspected something was different about your financial situation, Uncle Frank finally admitted. You paid for that expensive dinner at Morton's last month without even checking the bill. You bought Emma that high-end art set for her birthday. You seem more relaxed about money than usual. So you hired someone to investigate my personal finances. We asked a friend to do some discreet inquiries, Dad said defensively. We were concerned about you. Sudden changes in spending habits can be signs of various problems. Mike nodded gravely. Financial irresponsibility, gambling addiction, involvement with dangerous people. We needed to know what was going on. And when you discovered I'd inherited money legitimately, you decided I should share it. We decided you needed help managing it properly, Mom said. $10 million is a huge responsibility, May, more than any one person should have to handle alone. Jessica stood up and moved toward the front window, gesturing toward the driveway, where several cars were parked closely together. Speaking of handling things properly, we should probably discuss the logistics of this conversation. I followed her gaze and realized with growing horror that my car was completely boxed in by the other family vehicles. Mike's truck was parked directly behind me. Uncle Frank's SUV was blocking the left side, and Blake's sedan had been positioned to prevent any escape on the right. Interesting parking arrangement, I observed. Just coincidence, Jessica replied, but her smile suggested otherwise. Where are my car keys? I asked, suddenly remembering that Jessica had been digging through my purse when this entire nightmare began. Your keys. She looked around the room with exaggerated confusion. I'm not sure. Did you check your coat pockets? I rushed to the closet and searched through my jacket frantically, but the keys were nowhere to be found. Jessica, where are my keys? I honestly have no idea. Maybe they fell out somewhere. These things happen. The realization that I was effectively trapped in my childhood home by people who'd supposedly loved me unconditionally was terrifying and surreal. The house that had always represented safety and comfort had been transformed into a prison where my freedom was contingent on my willingness to sign legal documents, transferring my inheritance to my captors. This is kidnapping, I said quietly. This is family, Dad replied firmly, and family doesn't abandon each other when the going gets tough. Mike began organizing his documents into neat piles as if we were concluding a successful business negotiation. The transfer agreements can be signed tonight, and we can start the paperwork process first thing Monday morning. Everything can be completed before the holidays are over. And if I refuse, then we'll cross that bridge when we come to it, Jessica said ominously. But I really hope it doesn't come to that, May, for everyone's sake. The threat hung in the air like smoke, and I realized that the people I'd trusted most in the world had become strangers, willing to use any means necessary to get their hands on money that didn't belong to them. The Thanksgiving gathering had become a financial hostage situation, and I was the only person in the room who seemed to recognize it as such. The tension in the room had reached a suffocating level when I noticed my parents whispering urgently to each other near the fireplace. Their hushed conversation had an intensity that caught my attention, especially since they kept glancing in my direction with expressions that looked more guilty than angry. What are you two talking about over there? I demanded, my patience completely exhausted. Mom and Dad exchanged one more meaningful look before Dad cleared his throat nervously. May, there's something we need to tell you, something that might help you understand why this situation is so urgent for all of us. My stomach dropped as I recognized the tone in his voice. It was the same careful, measured way he'd spoken when he told me our childhood dog had been hit by a car, the way adults deliver news they know will cause pain. What now? I asked, though I wasn't sure I could handle any more revelations. Dad pulled a folded envelope from his back pocket, the paper wrinkled from being carried around for what looked like weeks. We've already taken a loan against your inheritance, $50,000. The words hit me like a physical blow. You've what? It was a bridge loan, Mom said quickly, her voice defensive and apologetic at the same time. Just temporary financing until we could formalize the inheritance sharing arrangement. I snatched the envelope from Dad's hands and pulled out the documents inside. The letterhead belonged to First National Bank, and the signature at the bottom was unmistakably meant to be mine. Except I'd never seen these papers before in my life. You forged my signature, I said, my voice hollow with disbelief. We used the power of attorney forms you signed when you went to that conference in California last year, Dad explained, as if this somehow made their fraud acceptable. You gave us permission to handle your affairs in your absence. I gave you permission to sign for package deliveries and emergency medical decisions, not to take loans against my bank account. Uncle Frank leaned forward with the expression of someone trying to mediate a reasonable disagreement. May, they were in a crisis situation. The roof was leaking. Jessica needed her car transmission replaced, and there were some unexpected medical bills. So you decided to steal from me to solve your problems. We didn't steal anything, Mom protested. We borrowed against money that we knew you'd eventually share with us anyway. It was just a matter of timing. I scanned the loan documents more carefully, my hands shaking as the full scope of their deception became clear. They'd listed themselves as my financial advisors and provided bank statements showing my inheritance as collateral. The loan had been approved 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks. I said slowly. "You've been planning this ambush for 3 weeks." "We've been trying to find the right way to approach a delicate family situation," Dad corrected. "The loan gave us time to research the best way to handle things legally and ethically." Jessica moved closer, her expression shifting from aggressive to pleading. "May, try to understand. We were drowning. Mom and Dad's roof was literally collapsing in their bedroom. I was about to lose my car, which means I would have lost both my jobs. Sometimes desperate situations require immediate action. Desperate situations require you to ask for help, not to forge my signature on loan documents." Blake held up his phone, showing me what appeared to be a banking app. "The good news is that your credit score is still excellent. The loan is actually helping your credit history by showing responsible debt management." The casual way he discussed my credit score, as if he had any right to monitor my financial information, was infuriating. "Have you all been tracking my bank accounts? My credit reports? What other aspects of my privacy have you violated?" Mike opened his briefcase again and pulled out a thick folder. "We've been monitoring your financial activity to ensure your security and well-being. Large inheritances can make people targets for scams and exploitation." "So you decided to scam and exploit me yourselves?" "We're protecting you from strangers who might take advantage of your naivety about money management," Aunt Dorothy said with the patronizing tone of someone explaining simple concepts to a child. I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "I'm leaving right now. This conversation is over." "May, please," Mom said, reaching toward me with tears in her eyes. "Don't leave angry. We can work this out as a family." "Where are my keys, Jessica?" She looked around the room helplessly. "I honestly don't remember where I put them. Maybe we should look for them together after we finish discussing the transfer agreements." The lie was so transparent that it was almost insulting. "You're holding me here against my will." "We're asking you to stay long enough to have an important family conversation," Dad said firmly. "No one is holding you against your will." "Then move the cars so I can leave." Uncle Frank shrugged apologetically. "I gave my keys to Blake earlier, and I think he ran to the store for something." "What did Blake need to buy at the store on Thanksgiving evening?" "Ice," Blake said quickly. "We needed more ice for drinks." I looked around the living room, noting the complete absence of any drinks that would require ice. The lie was so poorly constructed that even Jessica winced. "This is insane," I said, pulling out my cell phone. "I'm calling an Uber." That's when I discovered that my phone battery was completely dead despite having charged it fully that morning. I looked around for a charging cable, but the outlets that normally had chargers plugged into them were mysteriously empty. "Does anyone have a phone charger I can borrow?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "I think there might be one upstairs in the guest bedroom," Mom suggested. "Why don't you go look while we clean up these documents and figure out where everyone's keys ended up?" The suggestion felt like a trap, but I was desperate enough to try anything. I headed upstairs, acutely aware that I was leaving the room where all the evidence of their fraud was scattered across the coffee table. The guest bedroom looked exactly as it had during my last visit, except that every electronic device had been removed. No phone charger, no laptop, no alarm clock with a USB port. Even the landline telephone that had sat on the nightstand for 20 years was gone. I searched through all the drawers and checked every outlet, but it was obvious that anything I could use to communicate with the outside world had been deliberately removed. They'd planned this isolation as carefully as they'd planned the financial ambush. When I returned to the living room, I found the family huddled together in what appeared to be an urgent conference. They separated quickly as I came down the stairs, but not before I caught fragments of their conversation. "Credit monitoring," Mike was saying. Adult Protective Services," Uncle Frank added. "Incompetency hearing," Jessica whispered. They were discussing the next steps in their campaign to gain control of my inheritance, and their confidence suggested they believed they held all the cards. The loan documents were gone from the coffee table, along with the transfer agreements and Mike's briefcase. "Find a charger," Dad asked with false casualness. "You know I didn't. Just like you know exactly where my car keys are." Jessica sat back down in her chair with a sigh of exaggerated patience. May, you're being paranoid. We're your family. We love you. Everything we're doing is because we want what's best for you. What's best for me is being allowed to leave this house whenever I choose. What's best for you, Mom said softly, is taking time to really think about this decision. Money this significant requires careful consideration, not emotional reactions. Blake returned from his supposed ice run, but I noticed he wasn't carrying any bags or containers. Store was closed, he announced. Holiday hours. The lie was so obvious that I almost laughed. Which store closes at 7:30 on Thanksgiving? The one I went to, he replied with a straight face. From the kitchen, I could hear Grandma Ruth humming quietly to herself as she continued cleaning up the abandoned Thanksgiving dinner. She seemed oblivious to the hostage situation unfolding in the next room, or perhaps she was deliberately staying out of family business that had turned toxic. I want to talk to Grandma, I announced. She's busy cleaning up, Jessica said quickly. Maybe later, after we resolve these financial questions. I want to talk to her now. May. Dad said with finality, you're going to sit down and we're going to finish this conversation like adults. No more running around the house, no more phone calls, no more attempts to avoid your responsibilities. The word responsibilities hung in the air like a weapon. In their minds, my only responsibility was to hand over the money that Robert had left me to honor his memory and continue his work. The idea that I might have other obligations, other plans, other priorities was completely foreign to them. My responsibilities, I said slowly, are to make decisions about my inheritance that honor the person who left it to me. Robert trusted me to use this money wisely, and giving it away to solve everyone else's financial problems is not what he had in mind. Robert is dead, Jessica said bluntly. He doesn't get a vote in this family decision. This isn't a family decision, it's my decision. Not anymore, Mike said quietly from his position near the fireplace. Not once we demonstrate that you're not capable of making rational choices about financial matters. The threat was now explicit rather than implied. They were prepared to have me declared mentally incompetent if I refused to voluntarily surrender my inheritance. The people who'd raised me, who'd claimed to love me unconditionally, were ready to destroy my legal autonomy to get access to money that had never belonged to them. From the kitchen came the sound of Grandma Ruth opening and closing cabinet doors, the domestic sounds of someone putting a house back in order after a disrupted meal. The contrast between her peaceful activity and the financial warfare surrounding me felt surreal and telling. You can't keep me here forever, I said. We don't need forever, Dad replied. We just need long enough for you to come to your senses. The desperation I felt was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. My own family had transformed into captors, and the house where I'd grown up had become a prison designed to break my will. I needed to escape, but every conventional option had been systematically eliminated. I need some air, I announced, walking toward the front door with forced casualness. It's getting pretty cold out there, Jessica observed, but she didn't try to stop me directly. I twisted the doorknob and stepped onto the front porch, immediately feeling the bite of the November evening air against my skin. The temperature had dropped significantly since I'd arrived, and frost was beginning to form on the car windshields in the driveway. The sight that greeted me was like a carefully choreographed parking nightmare. My silver Honda Civic was completely trapped in the center of a ring of larger vehicles. Mike's black pickup truck was parked so close to my rear bumper that I couldn't have fit a sheet of paper between them. Uncle Frank's massive SUV blocked my left side, positioned at an angle that would make escape impossible even if I could somehow move the truck. Blake's sedan completed the barricade on the right side, parked close enough to my passenger door that I couldn't even open it fully. I walked around the entire perimeter of vehicles looking for any possible escape route. There wasn't one. Even if I had my keys, even if the other cars weren't there, Mike's truck was positioned so precisely that I would need at least 3 feet of clearance to back out, and I had maybe 3 inches. Checking on your car, Mike called from the doorway, his tone friendly but his eyes watchful. Just getting some air, like I said. It's a beautiful night, Very clear. You can see all the stars out here away from the city lights. His casual conversation felt surreal given that he was one of the people responsible for trapping me here. I looked up at the sky, noting that he was right about the stars, but also noting something else. We were indeed far from city lights, which meant we were also far from neighbors' witnesses or anyone who might hear calls for help. My parents had moved to this rural property 5 years ago, seeking peace and quiet in their retirement. The nearest neighbor was at least half a mile away through thick woods. Even if I could get someone's attention by the time help arrived, my family would have plenty of time to move the cars and claim this was all a misunderstanding. Jessica appeared in the doorway behind Mike. "You're going to catch pneumonia out there in just that sweater." "I'm fine." "Come back inside. We can finish our conversation and then we'll figure out the car situation." The way she said car situation made it clear that my vehicle would remain trapped until I signed their transfer agreements. I was effectively being held for ransom with my own inheritance as the demanded payment. I walked back into the house, my mind racing through possible escape scenarios. Call for help, somehow find an alternate transportation method, or convince someone in my family to develop a conscience. None of these options seemed particularly promising. "Did you enjoy your fresh air?" Dad asked as I settled back into my assigned chair. "Very much. It reminded me how much I value my freedom." The pointed comment earned me disapproving looks from around the room, but no one acknowledged the obvious implications of my words. Speaking of freedom, Mom said we should probably discuss some practical matters while we're all together. The transfer documents Mike prepared include tax implications that need to be addressed before the end of the calendar year. Tax implications. Mike nodded enthusiastically. Gift tax exclusions, charitable deductions, family partnership structures. There are several strategies we can use to minimize the tax burden for everyone involved. Tax burden on money you're stealing from me. Tax burden on money we're helping you distribute responsibly, Uncle Frank corrected. The IRS doesn't care about family dynamics. They just want their cut of any large financial transfers. Blake pulled out his phone and began reading from what appeared to be a tax preparation website. According to this, if you gift more than $15,000 to any individual in a calendar year, you have to file special forms and potentially pay gift taxes on the excess amount. So you've been researching how to structure your theft in the most tax-efficient manner possible. We've been researching how to help you comply with federal tax law while providing assistance to family members in need, Jessica said, with the practiced patience of someone explaining simple concepts to a difficult child. Aunt Dorothy leaned forward with what she probably thought was a helpful suggestion. The article I read online said that family financial planning should always include professional consultation. Maybe we should schedule an appointment with an accountant next week. An accountant who would help you figure out how to steal my money more efficiently. An accountant who would ensure that everyone's interests are protected and all legal requirements are met, Dad said firmly. The conversation had taken on the surreal quality of people discussing vacation planning while holding someone hostage. They were calmly debating tax implications and professional consultations as if I had already agreed to surrender my inheritance and was simply working out the logistics. From the kitchen came the sound of water running and dishes clinking as Grandma Ruth continued cleaning up the abandoned Thanksgiving feast. I wondered if she had any idea what was happening in the next room, or if she was deliberately staying out of a family conflict that had spiraled beyond any reasonable boundaries. "I want to help Grandma with the dishes," I announced, standing up from my chair. "She's got everything under control," Jessica said quickly. "Besides, we're not finished with our conversation yet." "I think we are finished. I think this conversation ended when you started forging my signature and holding me hostage." "No one is holding you hostage," Mom protested. "You're free to participate in this family discussion or not, but the responsible thing to do is work together to find solutions that benefit everyone." "The responsible thing to do is call the police and report multiple felonies." Mike laughed with the confidence of someone who'd anticipated this threat. and tell them that your family invited you for Thanksgiving dinner and asked you to consider helping them with their financial problems, that we discussed legal documents for voluntary financial transfers, that we expressed concern about your decision-making capacity regarding large sums of money. His summary made their actions sound completely reasonable, which I realized was probably exactly how they'd present the situation to any outside authority. A family gathering where concerned relatives tried to help someone manage a large inheritance responsibly. You forged my signature on loan documents. We used power of attorney privileges that you granted us legally, Dad corrected. We can document the emergency circumstances that required immediate action. You're holding me here against my will. We're asking you to stay for a family conversation, Uncle Frank said. No one has threatened you or physically restrained you. You've blocked my car and hidden my keys. Parking is always challenging when everyone comes for holidays, Blake said with a shrug. Keys get misplaced in the confusion. These things happen. Every accusation I could make had been anticipated and neutralized. They'd constructed their trap carefully ensuring that their actions could be explained as reasonable family behavior rather than criminal conspiracy. And if I try to walk out of here and hike to the nearest neighbor, it's 28 degrees outside, it's dark, and you're wearing inappropriate clothing for a long walk through the woods, Jessica observed. We'd be irresponsible family members if we let you endanger yourself like that. So you'd physically prevent me from leaving. We'd try to talk you out of making a dangerous and irrational decision, Mom said. Just like we're trying to talk you out of making a dangerous and irrational financial decision. The psychological manipulation was masterful. They'd positioned themselves as the reasonable, caring family members, trying to protect me from my own poor judgment. Any resistance to their demands would be framed as evidence of the mental instability they were claiming as justification for taking control of my inheritance. I realized with growing horror that they'd probably been planning this trap for weeks, researching not just the legal mechanisms for accessing my money, but also the psychological techniques for breaking down my resistance. Every argument, every emotional manipulation, every practical obstacle had been carefully designed to push me towards surrender. You're all insane, I said quietly. We're all desperate, Jessica replied with equal quiet, and desperate people do whatever it takes to survive. The admission was chilling in its honesty. They weren't motivated by love or concern for my well-being. They were motivated by their own financial desperation, and they were prepared to destroy family relationships and violate laws to get what they needed. From the kitchen, Grandma Ruth's voice called out, "May, honey, could you come help me reach something on the high shelf?" "Nei-ni-ti-tai." "She's busy right now, Grandma," Jessica called back. "It'll just take a minute," Ruth insisted. I looked around the room at my captors, testing whether they'd actually try to physically prevent me from helping an elderly woman with a simple request. "Go ahead," Dad said after a moment, "but make it quick. We still have important business to finish." The kitchen felt like a sanctuary compared to the hostile atmosphere of the living room. Grandma Ruth stood at the sink, her silver hair pinned back in the same style she'd worn for as long as I could remember, her hands moving efficiently as she scraped plates and organized leftovers. "What did you need help reaching?" I asked, looking around at the spotless counters and neatly arranged dishes. She glanced toward the living room, then motioned for me to come closer to the pantry. "Nothing," she whispered. "I just wanted to get you away from that circus for a few minutes." The relief I felt at having one ally in this house was overwhelming. "Grandma, you have no idea what's going on in there." "Oh, I have a pretty good idea," she said quietly, continuing to wash dishes as if we were having a casual conversation. "I've been listening to enough to know your family has lost their minds over money that doesn't belong to them. They've forged my signature, they're holding me here, they're threatening to have me declared incompetent. I don't know what to do." Ruth dried her hands on a dish towel and moved to the far corner of the kitchen, motioning for me to follow. She opened a drawer I'd never paid attention to before and pulled out what looked like an old Nokia flip phone. "Emergency phone," she explained. I keep it hidden because sometimes the power goes out and the cordless phones don't work. My hands shook as I opened the phone and saw that it had a full battery and signal strength. Can I call for help? Who are you going to call, honey, the police, and tell them what, that your family is having an argument about money? She had a point. The situation was complex and nuanced, and I wasn't sure how to explain it quickly to a dispatcher who'd probably heard dozens of family dispute calls over the years. My lawyer, I said suddenly. I need to call my lawyer. Now that makes sense. I scrolled through my memory trying to remember Sarah Martinez's number. I'd programmed it into my smartphone months ago, but I'd never memorized it. After several failed attempts, I remembered that her business card was in my wallet. With Ruth standing guard near the kitchen entrance, I dialed Sarah's number, praying she'd answer her phone on Thanksgiving evening. After 4 rings, her familiar voice came through the speaker. Sarah Martinez. Sarah, it's May. I'm so sorry to call you on a holiday, but I'm in serious trouble. May, what's wrong? You sound terrified. I'm trapped at my parents' house. My family found out about the inheritance, and they're demanding I transfer most of it to them. They've forged my signature on loan documents they're holding me here against my will, and they're threatening to have me declared incompetent if I don't comply. There was a moment of silence before Sarah responded, her voice immediately shifting into professional mode. Are you in immediate physical danger? Not physical danger, but they've blocked my car and hidden my keys. I can't leave. I'm recording this call. Tell me everything that's happened since you arrived there. For the next 10 minutes, I whispered the details of my family's coordinated attack, from Jessica's discovery of the bank statements to Mike's legal documents to the forged loan papers. Sarah asked pointed questions about timing, specific threats, and the evidence I'd seen. May, what you're describing constitutes multiple felonies: forgery, fraud, false imprisonment, conspiracy to commit financial exploitation. They're claiming they use power of attorney privileges. Power of attorney doesn't authorize them to forge your signature on loan documents without your knowledge or consent. That's textbook fraud. Ruth waved at me urgently from her position near the door, indicating that someone was approaching the kitchen. I cupped my hand over the phone's speaker. Sarah, I have to go, but please don't hang up. Can you stay on the line and listen? I'll stay connected. If this situation escalates, I'll call the police myself. I slipped the phone into my pocket just as Jessica appeared in the kitchen doorway. What's taking so long in here? She asked suspiciously. We were just talking about Grandma's stuffing recipe, I said, hoping my voice sounded normal. The stuffing from dinner that nobody ate because you turned Thanksgiving into a financial intervention, Ruth said sharply, and I was surprised by the edge in her voice. Jessica's expression softened slightly. Grandma, we're just trying to work out some family business. May inherited some money, and we're discussing how to handle it responsibly. Responsibly? Ruth repeated. Is that what you call forging someone's signature and trapping them in their childhood home? My heart stopped. Grandma Ruth knew exactly what was happening, and she wasn't afraid to confront Jessica about it. Nobody's trapped anywhere, Jessica said defensively. We're having a family conversation. A conversation that requires hiding car keys and blocking driveways. Grandma, you don't understand the complexity of the situation. Ruth turned to face Jessica fully, and despite being in her 80s and standing barely 5 feet tall, she suddenly seemed formidable. I understand that your sister inherited money that doesn't belong to you, and instead of being happy for her, you've decided to steal it. We're not stealing anything. We're asking for help. You're demanding a specific amount of money according to documents your husband prepared in advance. That's not asking for help. That's extortion. I could hear Sarah's voice faintly through the phone in my pocket, probably straining to listen to the conversation. The fact that she was documenting everything gave me some comfort, but I still felt trapped and desperate. May needs guidance about how to manage this much money, Jessica said, her voice taking on the patronizing tone she'd been using all evening. $10 million is a huge responsibility. $10 million is her responsibility, Ruth replied firmly. Not yours, not your parents', not your husband's. Hers. Jessica's facade of reasonableness began to crack. She's being selfish, Grandma. She's choosing money over family. She's choosing to maintain control of her own inheritance over people who are trying to steal it through legal manipulation and emotional blackmail. The words hung in the air between them like weapons. Ruth had just articulated exactly what was happening with brutal clarity, and Jessica had no response that wouldn't sound like an admission of guilt. "We should get back to the others," Jessica said finally. "Yes, we should," Ruth agreed, "because I have some things to say to that group of thieves masquerading as a loving family." As we walked back toward the living room, I felt the phone vibrating in my pocket. Sarah was probably getting an earful of evidence that would support any criminal charges we might need to file later. "Everything okay in there?" Dad called as we entered the room. "Just fine," Ruth replied sweetly. "In fact, I think it's time I joined this family conversation about May's money." The change in atmosphere was immediate and electric. Ruth had always been the respected matriarch of our family, the one whose opinions carried weight and whose disapproval could silence any argument. Her decision to involve herself in this confrontation clearly worried everyone. "Grandma, this is really between May and her immediate family," Uncle Frank said carefully. "May is my immediate family, too," Ruth replied, settling into her favorite chair with the deliberate movements of someone preparing for battle. "And from what I've been hearing, she needs someone in her corner who isn't trying to rob her blind." Mike's confident demeanor faltered slightly. "Mrs. Chen, I think there might be some misunderstanding about what we're trying to accomplish here." "The only misunderstanding," Ruth said calmly, "is your apparent belief that you can commit multiple felonies against my granddaughter and call it family financial planning." The word felonies seemed to electrify the room. These people had convinced themselves they were engaged in reasonable family negotiations, but Ruth's blunt assessment forced them to confront the criminal nature of their actions. In my pocket, I could feel the phone still connected to Sarah, who was undoubtedly recording every word of this conversation. For the first time since Jessica had found those bank statements, I felt like I had some measure of protection and support. "Now then," Ruth continued, "I believe you all have some explaining to do." The introduction of Grandma Ruth as an active participant in the conversation had shifted the power dynamics dramatically. She commanded a level of respect that even these desperate, money-hungry relatives couldn't entirely dismiss, and her direct accusations of criminal behavior had rattled their confidence. But what happened next revealed the true nature of the coalition that had formed against me. Within minutes of Ruth's arrival, the united front my family had presented began to fracture as their individual greed overcame their temporary cooperation. "Before we discuss anything else," Blake said, pulling Mike aside for what was clearly meant to be a private conversation, "I need to understand exactly how you calculated those distribution percentages." Mike looked uncomfortable as he realized their whispered discussion was being overheard by everyone in the room. "We can go over the details later, Blake. I'd rather go over them now, because the numbers you showed me earlier don't match what Jessica described when she called me last week." Jessica's eyes widened with alarm. "Blake, this isn't the time or place for that conversation." "Actually, I think it's exactly the time and place," Uncle Frank interjected, "because I'm also confused about the amounts you promised versus what's written in those legal documents." The careful coordination that had seemed so intimidating earlier was falling apart as the conspirators realized they'd been lying to each other about their intended shares of my inheritance. The greed that had united them against me was now turning them against each other. "What exactly did Jessica promise you, Frank?" Aunt Dorothy asked with growing suspicion. "She said the family members would split $4 million equally, which would be about $800,000 each for the 5 of us. But Mike's documents show much smaller amounts for everyone except Jessica's immediate family." Blake pulled out his phone and began scrolling through what appeared to be text messages. "She told me Linda's medical expenses would be fully covered, plus enough for our mortgage. That would be at least $300,000, but the contract allocates less than half that amount. The revelation that Jessica had been making separate promises to each family member sent shockwaves through the group. The alliance that had seemed so solid and threatening was revealed to be built on lies and false promises. "Jessica," Mom said slowly, "what did you tell everyone about how much money they would receive?" "I told everyone that we'd work together to make sure their needs were met," Jessica replied defensively. "That's not what you told me," Uncle Frank said with rising anger. "You specifically said I'd get enough to restart my restaurant. $800,000, you said. Enough to lease a new space and buy equipment and cover operating expenses for the first year. And you told me Linda could get the experimental treatment in Houston," Blake added. "That treatment cost $200,000 alone, plus travel and lodging expenses." Aunt Dorothy stood up with her hands on her hips, suddenly looking more like an angry creditor than a concerned family member. "You promised me enough money to pay off the medical bills and renovate the family cabin. You said once we had access to May's inheritance, everyone's financial problems would be solved." The mathematical impossibility of Jessica's promises was becoming obvious to everyone. Even if they successfully stole my entire inheritance, there wouldn't be enough money to fulfill all the commitments she'd apparently made. "I said we'd work together to prioritize everyone's needs," Jessica repeated, but her voice lacked conviction. Mike tried to support his wife, but his legal training made him too careful with words to be an effective liar. The distribution formula takes into account various factors, including family relationship proximity, current financial status, and urgent need priorities. "What does that mean in plain English?" Blake demanded. "It means," Ruth said with icy clarity, "that Jessica planned to keep most of the money for herself and give the rest of you just enough to keep you quiet." The truth of Ruth's assessment was written all over Jessica's face. She'd manipulated everyone's financial desperation to build a coalition against me, but she'd never intended to share the spoils equitably. "That's not true," Jessica protested, but her denial was weak and unconvincing. "Then show us the exact numbers," Uncle Frank challenged. "Show us exactly how much each person would receive according to those legal documents." Mike reluctantly retrieved his briefcase and pulled out the transfer agreements. As he read the specific dollar amounts aloud, the scope of Jessica's deception became undeniable. She and her family were set to receive $4 million, while everyone else would split the remaining distributions, which averaged less than $200,000 per person. $200,000. Blake repeated in disbelief. "Jessica, you told me Linda would get the best cancer treatment available. $200,000 wouldn't cover half of what she needs. And I was supposed to restart my restaurant with $300,000, Uncle Frank said with bitter laughter. "Do you have any idea what commercial kitchen equipment costs?" Aunt Dorothy sank back into her chair with a look of stunned betrayal. "You promised me enough to secure my retirement. $350,000 wouldn't last 5 years at current medical costs." The coalition that had seemed so formidable an hour earlier was disintegrating into accusations and counter-accusations. The family members who'd been pressuring me to share my inheritance were now turning on each other with the same aggressive energy they'd directed at me. "We can adjust the percentages," Jessica said desperately. "The documents are flexible." "Adjust them, Haugesa," Blake demanded. "There's not enough money to fulfill all the promises you made, even if May gave us every penny." "We could structure it differently," Mike suggested, but his voice lacked the confidence he'd displayed earlier. "Loans instead of gifts, payment plans, equity partnerships." "Equity partnerships in what?" Uncle Frank scoffed. "You're talking about dividing up money that doesn't belong to any of us in the first place." Ruth had remained silent during this exchange, but I could see her taking notes in a small notebook she'd retrieved from her purse. Every promise, every contradiction, every admission was being documented. "The truth is," she said when the arguing died down slightly, "Jessica has been playing all of you against each other. She told each of you what you wanted to hear to get your support for stealing May's inheritance, knowing full well that she couldn't deliver on those promises. "That's not true," Jessica said, but her voice was barely above a whisper. "Then explain why you told Frank he'd get $800,000 when the documents allocate him $300,000. There were different versions of the plan." "Different versions of the lie, you mean?" "The phone in my pocket had been vibrating periodically, which I assumed was Sarah sending me text updates or trying to get my attention. The fact that she was documenting this entire conversation, including the admission of financial fraud and the revelation of Jessica's systematic deception, would be invaluable if we needed to pursue criminal charges." "Maybe we should take a step back," Dad suggested weakly, clearly uncomfortable with how quickly their united front had collapsed. "Maybe we should face the truth," Ruth replied, "which is that this entire scheme was Jessica's idea from the beginning, and the rest of you were just useful idiots who provided legitimacy for her attempted theft." The harsh assessment silenced the room. Nobody could deny that Jessica had been the driving force behind the evening's events, from her discovery of the bank statements to her production of Emma's letter to her husband's legal documents. "We were all just trying to help our families," Aunt Dorothy said sadly. "You were all trying to steal money that doesn't belong to you," Ruth corrected. "And now you're discovering that the person who organized this scheme was planning to cheat you just as much as she was planning to cheat May." In my pocket, the phone vibrated again, more insistently this time. I had a feeling Sarah was preparing to take action based on what she'd been hearing, and I wondered if this nightmare was finally approaching its end. As the family argument continued to spiral out of control, I noticed Jessica frantically texting someone on her phone, while the others debated distribution percentages and broken promises. Her behavior seemed more desperate than angry, and something about her body language suggested she was dealing with pressures beyond what was happening in this room. When she stepped away to take a phone call, speaking in hushed, urgent tones, I made a decision that would change everything. While the others were distracted by their financial grievances, I quietly moved to where Jessica had left her oversized purse and began searching through it. I'd learned this invasion of privacy from Jessica herself, who'd started this entire nightmare by rifling through my belongings without permission. Now I was hoping to understand what was really driving her desperate behavior. What I found was worse than anything I could have imagined. Buried beneath her wallet and makeup, folded into a small zippered compartment, were dozens of official-looking documents that painted a picture of financial devastation that went far beyond anything she'd admitted to the family. Court summonses, collection agency, letters, foreclosure notices, and legal documents that revealed the scope of her desperation. The first document that caught my attention was a foreclosure notice dated just 2 weeks ago. Jessica and Mike were 30 days away from losing their house, not because of normal financial struggles, but because Jessica owed over $200,000 to various creditors. As I read through the papers with growing horror, a pattern emerged that explained everything about this evening's events. Jessica had a severe gambling addiction that she'd been hiding from everyone, including her husband. Online poker sites, sports, betting platforms, and even illegal bookmakers were demanding payment for debts she'd accumulated over the past 3 years. The medical expenses she'd claimed for Emma were actually legal fees for debt collection lawsuits. The car transmission she'd said needed replacement had actually been repossessed 2 months ago. The college fund she'd mentioned for Emma had been empty for over a year, drained to pay minimum payments on credit cards that were now maxed out. But the most devastating discovery was a series of letters from a predatory lending company that specialized in high-interest loans to desperate people. Jessica had borrowed money from these loan sharks to hire the private investigator who discovered my inheritance, putting her family at risk from criminals who didn't hesitate to use violence to collect debts. "What are you doing?" Jessica's voice behind me was sharp with panic. I turned around with the documents in my hands, no longer feeling intimidated by someone whose entire life was built on lies and desperation. "Learning the truth about why you're really trying to steal my inheritance. Those are private papers. You have no right to look through my personal belongings." "Like you had no right to look through mine?" The rest of the family gathered around as I spread the most damning documents across the coffee table. The foreclosure notice, the gambling debt collection letters, the loan shark agreements, the court summonses for unpaid creditors. $200,000 in gambling debts, Jessica sports betting and online poker. Ain't seen teen. Mike stared at the papers with an expression of absolute shock. Jessica, what is this? What are these documents? I can explain everything, she said quickly, but her voice carried the desperate tone of someone whose lies were finally catching up with her. You owe money to illegal bookmakers. I continued reading from one of the more threatening letters. People who have made specific promises about what happens if you don't pay them back within 30 days. Dad picked up the foreclosure notice with trembling hands. You're losing your house, but you said the mortgage was current. It is current, Jessica protested weakly. This is just a legal technicality. A legal technicality that gives the bank permission to evict you and your children on December 15th, Ruth observed, reading over Dad's shoulder. Blake stared at the collection agency letters with growing understanding. Emma doesn't need surgery money. You need money to avoid being beaten up by loan sharks. That's not entirely. And there's no college fund. Mom said sadly, holding up a bank statement that showed Emma's education account had been emptied months ago. You've already spent your daughter's future to feed your gambling addiction. The depth of Jessica's deception was breathtaking. Every financial crisis she'd mentioned, every urgent need she'd used to manipulate the family's emotions was either completely fabricated or caused by her secret gambling problem. The private investigator who discovered May's inheritance, Uncle Frank said, reading from another document. You paid him with money borrowed from these predatory lenders. I had to find out about the money somehow, Jessica said defensively. You put your family at risk with dangerous criminals to investigate your sister's private finances. Mike was reading through the documents with the pale expression of someone discovering their entire marriage had been built on lies. The second mortgage on our house, the equity line of credit, the credit cards I thought were for household expenses, all of it went to gambling. Mike, I can stop anytime I want. I just need this one big win to get even. You need professional help, Ruth said firmly, and your children need protection from the consequences of your addiction. The phone in my pocket vibrated again, and I realized Sarah was probably getting more evidence than she'd ever expected when I'd called for help. Jessica's gambling addiction, her debts to dangerous criminals, her systematic deception of her family, all of it was being recorded and documented. So, this entire evening, I said slowly, was about getting money to pay off your gambling debts and avoid foreclosure. The family constitution, Emma's letter, everyone's financial needs, all of it was manipulation to cover up your addiction. Everyone does have real financial needs, Jessica protested. Real financial needs that you exploited and exaggerated to build a coalition against me, I corrected. You researched their problems, made promises you couldn't keep, and convinced them to participate in fraud to solve your gambling debt crisis. Aunt Dorothy looked at Jessica with a mixture of pity and disgust. You used our medical bills and business failures to justify stealing from your sister. I wasn't stealing, I was borrowing against money that should be shared anyway. Borrowing, Blake repeated. With what collateral? What assets do you have that could guarantee repayment of $4 million? The question hung in the air unanswered because everyone in the room now understood that Jessica had no assets, no income, and no realistic prospect of repaying anyone anything. She was drowning in debt and had seen my inheritance as her only lifeline, regardless of the cost of family relationships or legal consequences. The worst part, Ruth said quietly, is that you've taught your children that family members steal from each other when they're desperate. What kind of lesson is that for Emma and Tyler and Madison? For the first time all evening, Jessica began to cry real tears instead of manipulative ones. The weight of her deception, her addiction, and the damage she'd done to her family was finally breaking through the desperate facade she'd maintained. But it was too late for sympathy. The document spread across the table told the story of someone who'd chosen gambling over her children's security lies, over honest communication, and theft over legitimate help-seeking. The family intervention she'd orchestrated against me had revealed her own need for intervention against an addiction that was destroying everyone around her. As the family sat in stunned silence processing the revelations about Jessica's gambling addiction and the web of lies that had orchestrated this evening's events, Grandma Ruth stood up from her chair with a purposefulness that commanded everyone's attention. "I think it's time I shared some things that might help everyone understand what's really happening here." She announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd been observing family dynamics for 8 decades. She walked to the old oak secretary desk in the corner of the living room, the same piece of furniture that had held family documents and keepsakes for as long as I could remember. From the bottom drawer, she retrieved a metal lockbox that I'd never seen before. "Grandma," Dad said uncertainly, "what are you doing?" "I'm getting some evidence that your father left specifically for a situation like this one," Ruth replied, setting the box on the coffee table next to Jessica's scattered debt documents. She produced a small key from her pocket and opened the lockbox with deliberate ceremony. Inside were manila folders, legal documents, and what appeared to be a small digital recording device that looked surprisingly modern for someone of Ruth's generation. "Your grandfather was a wise man." Ruth began settling back into her chair with one of the folders in her lap. "He understood that money brings out the worst in people, even family members, especially family members." She opened the folder and pulled out a document that looked official and legal with multiple signatures and a notary seal. "This is his real will, the one most of you have never seen, along with instructions about protecting family members from exactly the kind of financial exploitation that's been attempted here tonight." Dad leaned forward with interest, but also with apprehension. "Mom, what are you talking about?" "We read Grandpa's will when he died. He left the house to you and divided his savings among the children." "He left you what he wanted you to have," Ruth corrected. "But he also established a protection fund specifically designed to help family members who might be targeted for their inheritances or other windfalls." She pulled out another document, this one more recent, with Robert Chen's name clearly visible at the top. "Robert came to see me 6 months before he died May. He was concerned about your family dynamics and wanted to make sure you'd have support if they ever tried to pressure you about money." My heart stopped. "Robert met with you?" "Several times. He was a lovely man who cared deeply about your well-being. He could see how your family treated you differently, how they expected more from you than they gave back. He was worried about what would happen if you ever came into significant money." Ruth reached into the lockbox again and pulled out the small recording device. "He also suggested I start documenting family interactions just in case legal evidence was ever needed." The blood drained from Jessica's face. "You've been recording us." "I've been recording every family gathering for the past 2 years. Ruth replied calmly. "Your grandfather's instructions were very specific about maintaining evidence of any attempts at financial coercion or abuse." She pressed a button on the device and suddenly Jessica's voice filled the room. "She talks about you constantly, May. You're like a hero to her. She tells everyone at school about her aunt who works with computers and makes important things." "That's from earlier this evening," Ruth explained, "when you were manipulating your daughter's admiration for her aunt to guilt May into giving you money." Mike's face had gone pale. As a paralegal, he understood the legal implications of recorded evidence better than anyone else in the room. "Mrs. Chen, what exactly have you documented?" "Everything," Ruth replied simply. "Jessica's lies about her financial situation, your forged loan documents, the coordination of this evening's ambush, the threats about declaring May incompetent, all of it." She pulled out yet another folder, this one thick with what appeared to be photographs and bank statements. "I also have documentation of your gambling activities, Jessica, screenshots of your online poker accounts, records of your sports betting correspondence with collection agencies." How could you possibly have access to that information? Jessica demanded. Because your grandfather's protection fund includes resources for investigating threats to family members, including private investigators when necessary. The irony was stunning. While Jessica had hired a private investigator to discover my inheritance, Ruth had been using professional investigators to document Jessica's gambling addiction and the growing threat it posed to the family. There's more. Ruth continued pulling out a thick manila envelope. Documentation of previous incidents where family members have attempted to pressure relatives for money. Your Aunt Margaret's inheritance in 2003, your cousin David's insurance settlement in 2008, your Uncle William's business sale proceeds in 2012. She spread photographs and documents across the table, creating a timeline of financial abuse that stretched back decades. This family has a pattern of targeting members who come into money using guilt and manipulation to force them to share their windfalls. Dad stared at the evidence with growing horror. Mom, are you saying we've done this before? I'm saying this family has done this before. Some of you participated, some of you were just witnesses, but it's happened repeatedly over the years. She pointed to specific photographs showing family gatherings that looked remarkably similar to tonight's scene. Margaret was pressured into giving away her parents' inheritance to pay for everyone's debts. David was guilted into using his insurance money to bail out 3 different relatives. William was manipulated into investing his business sale proceeds in family ventures that mysteriously failed. What happened to them? I asked, though I was afraid I already knew the answer. They learned to stay away from family gatherings. They stopped trusting the people who raised them. They built walls to protect themselves from future exploitation. Ruth pulled out one final document, this one bearing Robert Chen's signature and a recent date. Robert established a secondary trust fund specifically for situations like this. $1 million designated for helping family members with legitimate emergencies, but with legal safeguards to prevent abuse. $1 million, Blake asked hopefully. $1 million administered by professional trustees who verify actual need and ensure the money goes directly to legitimate expenses rather than to intermediaries who might misuse it, Ruth clarified. She looked directly at Blake as she continued. Linda's cancer treatment can be funded directly to the hospital. Frank's business recovery can be structured as a loan with reasonable repayment terms. Dorothy's medical bills can be paid directly to providers. And Jessica's gambling debts, Mom asked quietly, will not be paid from the emergency fund, Ruth replied firmly. Addiction-related debts are specifically excluded, but Jessica and her children can receive help with housing and basic needs while she gets professional treatment. The revelation that help was available but only through legitimate channels with proper oversight changed the entire dynamic of the evening. The desperate grab for my inheritance was unnecessary. There were resources available for genuine emergencies, just not for enabling gambling addiction or paying off criminals. Why didn't you tell us about this earlier? Uncle Frank asked. Because, Ruth said with a pointed look around the room, Robert and I wanted to see how you'd all behave when faced with the opportunity to exploit a family member's good fortune. We needed to know who could be trusted and who needed protection from their own worst instincts. She gestured toward the pile of evidence she'd assembled. Tonight's events have provided definitive answers to those questions. The phone in my pocket had stopped vibrating, and I realized that Sarah had probably heard enough to understand the full scope of what was happening. Ruth's revelation about Robert's foresight and preparation meant that I had far more support and protection than I'd realized. So what happens now? Jessica asked, her voice small and defeated. Now. Ruth replied, we clean up the mess you've made. The forged loan gets reported to the authorities. Your gambling addiction gets addressed through professional treatment. Your children get protected from the consequences of your poor decisions. And this family learns the difference between helping each other and exploiting each other. She closed the lockbox with finality, and May keeps her inheritance just as Robert intended, with the knowledge that she has resources available to help family members who genuinely need assistance. For the first time since Jessica had found those bank statements, I felt like I could breathe freely. The trap that had seemed so carefully constructed was revealed to be an illusion. I had allies, resources, and evidence of my family's criminal behavior. Most importantly, I had proof that Robert's love and protection extended beyond his death. "Thank you, Grandma," I said quietly. "Thank you, Robert," she replied, touching the lockbox gently. "He knew you'd need protection from the people who claimed to love you most." The transformation in the room's atmosphere was electric as I finally understood the full scope of protection and evidence that had been assembled around me. For hours, I'd felt trapped and outnumbered by people I'd trusted completely. Now I realized that the trap had been set for them, not for me. I reached into my pocket and pulled out Grandma Ruth's emergency phone, which had been connected to Sarah Martinez throughout most of the evening's events. The entire family watched as I put the call on speaker. "Sarah, are you still there?" "I'm here, May. I've been listening to everything for the past 3 hours. I have more than enough evidence to support multiple felony charges against several family members." The color drained from everyone's faces as they realized their threats, admissions, and criminal behavior had been documented by a lawyer who specialized in financial crimes. "What kind of charges?" Mike asked his paralegal training, making him understand the severity of their situation better than anyone else. "Forgery of financial documents, fraud, conspiracy to commit theft, attempted extortion, false imprisonment, and elder financial abuse for involving Mrs. Chen in your schemes," Sarah replied crisply. "I've also contacted law enforcement about the gambling debts Jessica owes to illegal bookmakers, which could involve federal racketeering charges." Jessica began shaking visibly. "Federal charges? When you borrowed money from loan sharks to hire private investigators to target family members' finances, you crossed several federal crime thresholds," Sarah explained. "The FBI takes illegal gambling operations very seriously, especially when they're used to facilitate other crimes." Dad slumped back in his chair as if he'd been physically struck. "Sarah, surely we can work this out within the family. These are misunderstandings that got out of hand." "Mr. Patterson, I have recordings of you admitting to forging May's signature on loan documents. I have evidence of coordinated efforts to manipulate and coerce her into transferring her inheritance. These aren't misunderstandings. They're premeditated felonies." Ruth opened her lockbox again and pulled out a small business card. "I should probably mention that I've also been in contact with Adult Protective Services about Jessica's attempts to exploit her elderly relatives for financial gain." "Adult Protective Services," Mom repeated weakly. "When family members use manipulation and threats to steal from relatives, especially when they involve elderly people in their schemes, it falls under elder abuse statutes," Ruth explained. "The social worker I spoke with was very interested in tonight's events." Blake looked around the room with growing panic. "Wait, are we all going to be arrested?" "That depends." Sarah's voice came through the phone speaker, "on how cooperative everyone is with returning stolen funds, making restitution, and ensuring this behavior never happens again." I felt a surge of confidence that had been completely absent all evening. Let me be very clear about what's going to happen now. First, the $50,000 loan that was taken using my forged signature will be reported to the bank and to law enforcement as fraud. "May, please," Dad began, but I cut him off. "Second, Jessica's gambling debts are her responsibility and hers alone. No family money will be used to pay off illegal bookmakers or predatory lenders." "But the children," Mom protested weakly. "The children will be protected through legitimate channels, not by enabling their mother's criminal behavior," I replied firmly. Ruth nodded approvingly. "The Emergency Trust Fund can provide temporary housing assistance and basic needs support, while Jessica gets professional treatment for her gambling addiction." Third, I continued feeling stronger with each word. Anyone who participated in tonight's conspiracy will face legal consequences unless they make full restitution and agree to court-supervised probation. Mike's legal training made him realize how serious their situation had become. "What kind of restitution?" Complete financial transparency, professional counseling for gambling addiction, and supervised contact with family members until trust can be rebuilt, Sarah replied through the speaker. And fourth, I said, looking directly at each person who'd participated in the evening's events, this family will learn to respect boundaries and understand the difference between asking for help and demanding money through threats and manipulation. Uncle Frank raised his hand tentatively like a student asking for permission to speak. What about our legitimate financial needs? Blake's wife really does need medical treatment. Legitimate needs will be addressed through legitimate channels, Ruth replied, patting the lockbox that contained Robert's emergency fund documentation. People who can demonstrate actual need without resorting to fraud or coercion will receive appropriate assistance. But not people who participated in tonight's criminal conspiracy, I added. Trust has to be rebuilt before any financial assistance can be considered. Jessica finally found her voice, though it was barely above a whisper. What about my children? They didn't do anything wrong. Your children will be protected, Ruth assured her. But protecting them means getting you professional help for your gambling addiction and ensuring they're not exposed to dangerous criminals who might come looking for debt payments. Sarah's voice came through the phone with additional information that sent chills through the room. I should mention that I've also been in contact with Child Protective Services about the gambling debts owed to dangerous individuals. Children cannot be safely housed in a home where loan sharks might show up demanding payment. The implications were staggering. Jessica's gambling addiction hadn't just threatened her own financial security, it had put her children in physical danger from criminals who didn't hesitate to use violence to collect debts. So what happens right now? Blake asked. Tonight, I mean. Tonight, I said, standing up for the first time in hours. I'm going home. My car keys are going to be returned. The vehicles blocking my driveway are going to be moved. And anyone who tries to prevent me from leaving will be arrested for kidnapping. May. Mom said desperately, surely we can work this out without involving the police. The police are already involved, Sarah replied. I contacted them an hour ago when it became clear that May was being held against her will. They're currently en route. The sound of approaching sirens in the distance confirmed Sarah's statement. After hours of feeling trapped and helpless, I was about to be rescued by law enforcement who'd been alerted to my situation by my own attorney. I suggest, Ruth said calmly, that everyone think very carefully about how they want to explain tonight's events to the officers who are about to arrive. The sirens were getting closer and I could see flashing lights beginning to reflect off the living room windows. The nightmare that had begun with Jessica finding bank statements in my purse was finally approaching its end, but not in the way any of them had anticipated. My keys, Jessica, I said firmly. With shaking hands, she reached into her pocket and pulled out my car keys, placing them on the coffee table like evidence in a criminal trial. Thank you, I said, pocketing the keys that represented my freedom. The siren stopped outside the house, followed by the sound of car doors slamming and heavy footsteps approaching the front porch. After the longest Thanksgiving of my life, help had finally arrived. The knock on the front door was firm and authoritative, exactly the sound I'd been hoping to hear for hours. Dad moved toward the door with reluctant steps, his face pale as he realized there was no way to avoid the consequences of the evening's events. Police were responding to a report of false imprisonment and financial crimes. Dad opened the door to reveal 2 uniformed officers and a plainclothes detective, all wearing expressions of professional seriousness. Behind them, I could see additional patrol cars with their lights still flashing, turning the quiet suburban street into a crime scene. I'm Detective Martinez with the Financial Crimes Unit, the woman in plain clothes announced as she entered the living room. We received a report from attorney Sarah Martinez about ongoing criminal activity at this residence. The coincidence of the shared last name wasn't lost on me, and I wondered if Sarah had specifically requested a detective who'd understand the family dynamics involved in financial exploitation cases. Officers. Dad began nervously. I think there's been some misunderstanding. We were just having a family discussion about inheritance planning. Detective Martinez surveyed the room, taking in the scattered legal documents, the gambling debt papers, the evidence Ruth had assembled, and the obvious tension among the family members. Which family member reported being held against their will? That would be me, I said, stepping forward with relief flooding through my voice. May Patterson. I've been prevented from leaving this house for several hours, while family members attempted to coerce me into signing documents, transferring my inheritance to them. And you are, the detective asked, turning to Jessica. Jessica Thompson, May's sister. This is all a big misunderstanding. One of the uniformed officers began taking notes while Detective Martinez examined the documents spread across the coffee table. These appear to be voluntary transfer agreements for substantial amounts of money. Can you explain why family members would need legal documents to discuss inheritance sharing? Mike stepped forward with the confidence of someone who believed his legal knowledge would help him navigate the situation. Detective, I'm a paralegal. I prepared those documents to formalize family financial assistance in a legally appropriate manner. And these documents, Detective Martinez asked, holding up the forged loan papers that Dad had reluctantly admitted to signing. Bank records show a $50,000 loan was taken against Ms. Patterson's account without her knowledge or consent. The room fell silent except for the sound of Aunt Dorothy crying softly into her hands. The reality of criminal charges was finally sinking in for people who'd convinced themselves they were engaged in reasonable family negotiations. We used power of attorney privileges, Dad said weakly. Power of attorney doesn't authorize forgery, Detective Martinez replied firmly. It allows you to act on someone's behalf with their knowledge and consent, not to sign their name to documents they've never seen. Ruth stood up from her chair and approached the detective with the dignity of someone who'd been anticipating this moment. Detective, I have extensive documentation of this evening's events, as well as evidence of a pattern of financial exploitation within this family. She handed over her lockbox and the recording device explaining how Robert Chen had anticipated this situation and helped her prepare evidence. The detective's expression grew more serious as she examined the contents. Mrs. Chen, this appears to be quite comprehensive. Audio recordings, financial documents, correspondence with collection agencies. How long have you been documenting these activities? 2 years of general family interactions, but tonight's events were recorded in real time at the request of Ms. Patterson's attorney. Detective Martinez turned back to Jessica with a new understanding of the scope of criminal activity involved. Ms. Thompson, these gambling debt documents show you owe substantial amounts to illegal bookmakers. Can you explain how that relates to tonight's attempted coercion of your sister? Jessica's composure finally cracked completely. I needed the money to pay them back. They threatened my family. They said if I didn't pay within 30 days, they'd hurt my children. So you attempted to steal your sister's inheritance to pay gambling debts to criminals. I wasn't stealing. I was borrowing against money that should be shared anyway. Without her consent, using forged documents and threats of legal action to declare her mentally incompetent. That's not borrowing, that's multiple felonies. The uniformed officers had been quietly positioning themselves throughout the room, and I realized they were prepared to make arrests if necessary. The casual family gathering had officially become a criminal investigation. Detective, Blake said desperately, some of us were misled about what was happening here. We thought we were just discussing family financial planning. Detective Martinez consulted her notes. Mr. Blake Patterson, according to the recorded evidence, you participated in blocking Ms. Patterson's vehicle to prevent her from leaving. You also admitted to researching legal precedents for challenging inheritance distributions. That suggests premeditation, not confusion. Uncle Frank raised his hand tentatively. What if we return any money we received and apologize for our involvement? The $50,000 obtained through forgery will need to be returned regardless, Detective Martinez replied. But that's restitution, not a defense against criminal charges. Mom had been silent throughout the police questioning, but she finally spoke up with desperation in her voice. Detective, we're a good family. We've never been in trouble with the law before. Surely this can be resolved without destroying our relationships forever. Mrs. Patterson, financial exploitation of family members is one of the most damaging crimes we investigate because it destroys trust in the relationships that should provide safety and support. Detective Martinez replied, "The fact that you're related to your victim makes this more serious, not less serious." The detective's phone buzzed and she stepped away to take a brief call before returning with additional information that sent shockwaves through the room. That was the FBI's Financial Crimes Task Force. They're very interested in the illegal gambling connections documented in your evidence. Jessica Thompson, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud forgery and money laundering related to illegal gambling operations. The words "under arrest" seemed to electrify the room. Jessica began crying as one of the uniformed officers approached her with handcuffs, reading her Miranda rights in a calm, professional voice. "Dad Patterson, you're also under arrest for forgery and fraud related to the unauthorized loan documents." Dad's legs seemed to give out as the second officer moved toward him. "Please, detective, I have a heart condition. This stress could kill me." "You'll receive medical attention at the station if necessary. Right now, you need to be processed for multiple felonies." Mike was frantically going through his briefcase, probably looking for legal documents that might help his situation, but Detective Martinez was already approaching him with a third officer. "Michael Thompson, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud and for preparing legal documents in furtherance of criminal activity." "I'm not even a lawyer," Mike protested as the handcuffs clicked into place. "I was just trying to help my family." "You prepared documents designed to facilitate the theft of substantial amounts of money. Your paralegal training makes that more serious, not less serious." As 3 family members were led away in handcuffs, the remaining relatives sat in stunned silence. The Thanksgiving gathering that had begun with turkey and gratitude had ended with arrests and criminal charges. "What happens to the rest of us?" Aunt Dorothy asked quietly. "That depends on your level of cooperation with the ongoing investigation and your willingness to make restitution for any money received through fraudulent means," Detective Martinez replied. She turned to me with the expression that was much warmer than the one she'd used with my family members. "Ms. Patterson, you're free to leave whenever you'd like. Your attorney is en route to provide additional support, and we have officers standing by if you need assistance removing your vehicle from the blocked driveway." After hours of feeling trapped and powerless, the simple statement that I was free to leave was overwhelmingly emotional. "Thank you, Detective. Thank you for taking this seriously." "Financial exploitation crimes destroy families and communities," she replied. "We take them very seriously, especially when they involve vulnerable individuals being targeted by people they should be able to trust." As the police cars pulled away with Jessica, Dad, and Mike in custody, I stood in the driveway breathing the cold November air and feeling truly free for the first time since Jessica had found those bank statements. The nightmare was finally over, but the healing process was just beginning. 6 months had passed since that devastating Thanksgiving evening, and the legal proceedings had finally reached their conclusion. The courtroom where Jessica, Dad, and Mike had been sentenced was the same one where I'd fought for Robert's wrongful death settlement years earlier, creating an odd symmetry to my legal struggles. Jessica had received 2 years of probation and mandatory gambling addiction treatment after pleading guilty to fraud and conspiracy charges. Her children were living with Mike's parents, while she completed an intensive residential treatment program, learning to rebuild her life without the destructive patterns that had driven her to steal from family. Dad had been sentenced to community service and financial counseling after his cooperation with investigators helped uncover the full scope of the family's history of financial manipulation. His health scare during the arrest had been real but minor, and he was slowly coming to terms with the damage his actions had caused to our relationship. Mike faced the most serious consequences as a legal professional who'd used his training to facilitate crimes. He'd lost his job, faced potential disbarment from paralegal practice, and was serving a year of home detention while paying restitution for the forged loan. But the most significant development had come from an unexpected source. That morning, I sat in Sarah Martinez's office, reviewing documents that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier. The secondary inheritance fund that Robert established is more comprehensive than even Ruth realized, Sarah explained, spreading out legal documents across her conference table. He created an entire foundation dedicated to helping families affected by workplace safety violations. I stared at the paperwork in amazement. A foundation. The Robert Chen Foundation for Workplace Safety and Family Support. $1 million in emergency assistance funding, plus an additional $4 million for ongoing programs. He'd been planning this for years before his death. The revelation that Robert had established an entire charitable foundation using his personal savings was overwhelming. He'd turned his own potential death into a resource for helping other families navigate the legal and financial challenges of wrongful death cases. There's more. Sarah continued, pulling out another folder. He specifically designated your family members as potential beneficiaries for legitimate assistance, but with strict oversight to prevent abuse. She showed me application forms and approval processes that were both generous and carefully controlled. Jessica's children can receive education funding administered through trustees. Your parents can get help with medical expenses that are paid directly to providers. Blake's wife can receive cancer treatment funding that goes straight to hospitals and specialists. But not gambling debt payments or general cash distributions. Absolutely not. Every dollar is tracked and verified to ensure it's used for legitimate needs. Robert's foundation prevents exactly the kind of exploitation your family attempted. The irony was perfect. The same person whose death had provided my inheritance had also created a safety net for my family members, but only if they were willing to seek help through honest, supervised channels, rather than through manipulation and theft. How are they responding to the foundation assistance? Sarah smiled for the first time since I'd known her. Much better than expected. Blake's wife, Linda, is receiving excellent cancer treatment, and she's doing well. Your parents are getting help with their mortgage and medical bills without the stress of managing large lump sums. Even Jessica's children are benefiting from education programs. I felt a complex mix of emotions, relief that my family's legitimate needs were being met, but also sadness that it had taken criminal charges and legal intervention to get them to accept help through appropriate channels. And Jessica. She's making genuine progress in treatment. According to her counselor, she's finally acknowledging the full scope of damage her addiction caused. She's asked if she could write you a letter of apology, but only if you're comfortable receiving it. The question caught me off guard. For months, I'd been working through my own therapy to process the betrayal and manipulation I'd experienced. The idea of communication with Jessica still felt overwhelming. Not yet, I decided. Maybe someday, but not yet. That's perfectly reasonable. Recovery is a long process, and rebuilding trust takes even longer. Sarah gathered the foundation documents and placed them in a folder marked with my name. Robert also left specific instructions about your role in managing the foundation. He wanted you to have complete control over how assistance is distributed. He trusted me with that much responsibility. He trusted you to honor his memory while protecting yourself from exploitation. The foundation gives you the power to help people genuinely in need, while maintaining boundaries against those who might try to take advantage of your generosity. I thought about Robert's wisdom in creating this system. He'd understood that my family's financial problems were real, but he'd also anticipated their potential for manipulation and abuse. By creating structured assistance with professional oversight, he'd solve both problems simultaneously. There's one more thing, Sarah said, retrieving a sealed envelope from her desk drawer. Robert left this for you to read after any major family conflicts involving your inheritance were resolved. I opened the envelope with trembling hands, recognizing Robert's careful handwriting on the enclosed letter. Dear May, it began. If you're reading this, it means your family has discovered your inheritance and reacted exactly as I feared they would. I'm sorry you had to experience their betrayal, but I'm proud of you for protecting yourself and maintaining your integrity under pressure." The letter continued for several pages, offering comfort, wisdom, and practical advice for moving forward. But the final paragraph brought tears to my eyes. "You have always been the daughter I never had, and I want you to build a life filled with people who love you for who you are not, for what you can give them. Use the foundation to help others, but never forget that your first obligation is to yourself and your own well-being. The family you choose will always be more important than the family you were born into." I wiped my eyes and looked up at Sarah, who had been waiting patiently while I read. "He really did think of everything, didn't he?" Robert was remarkable. He turned his own tragedy into protection and support for countless families, including yours. That's an incredible legacy. As I left Sarah's office that afternoon carrying the foundation documents and Robert's final letter, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't expected. The money that had caused so much family turmoil was now serving its intended purpose, helping people genuinely in need while honoring the memory of a man who'd valued integrity above all else. The foundation gave me a way to channel my inheritance into meaningful work, while the legal protections Robert had established ensured that I'd never again be vulnerable to the kind of exploitation my family had attempted. Most importantly, it proved that genuine love expresses itself through empowerment and protection, not through manipulation and control. As autumn returned a full year after that terrible Thanksgiving, I found myself standing in the visiting room at the treatment center where Jessica was completing her gambling addiction program. The decision to see her had been difficult, but my therapist had helped me understand that forgiveness didn't require reconciliation and boundaries didn't require permanent estrangement. Jessica looked different than I remembered. Thinner, certainly, but also somehow more present in her own skin. The desperate, calculating energy that had driven her manipulation was replaced by something that looked like genuine remorse and hard-won self-awareness. "May," she said quietly as we sat down across from each other at a small table near the window. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you ever would." "I wasn't sure either," I admitted. "But I've been working with a counselor who helps people navigate family relationships after financial abuse. She thought it might be helpful for both of us." Jessica nodded, her hands folded carefully in her lap. "I've been working with addiction specialists and family therapists here. They've helped me understand things about myself that I never wanted to face." The conversation felt stilted and careful, like two people learning to speak the same language after years of miscommunication. But there was something different about Jessica's demeanor that suggested genuine change rather than another manipulation. "The children are doing well," she continued. "Emma's thriving in the gifted program that the foundation sponsors. Tyler made the baseball team and his equipment is being provided through the Youth Athletics Grant. Madison's orthodontic work is covered by the Medical Assistance Program." I was surprised by how naturally she discussed the foundation assistance without any hint of entitlement or expectation. "How does it feel having their needs met through the foundation rather than through the money you tried to steal from me?" The direct question might have seemed harsh, but my therapist had stressed the importance of honest communication about what had actually happened. Jessica was quiet for a long moment before answering. "It feels like relief, actually. The foundation removes the pressure I used to feel to solve everyone's problems through gambling wins or family manipulation. Their needs are met appropriately, and I can focus on my own recovery. And your recovery is going well. Some days are better than others. I've learned that gambling addiction isn't just about money or winning. For me, it was about feeling powerful and important. When I was placing bets or manipulating family situations, I felt like I had control over outcomes that were actually completely unpredictable. The insight surprised me with its depth and self-awareness. What about the debt to the illegal bookmakers? The FBI's investigation led to arrests of several people involved in that operation. My debts were considered evidence in their criminal case rather than valid financial obligations. The dangerous people I was afraid of are now in federal prison. I felt a surge of relief I hadn't expected. The threat that had terrified Jessica and motivated much of her desperate behavior was gone, removed by law enforcement action rather than family capitulation. "Emma asks about you constantly," Jessica said softly. "She doesn't understand all the legal complexity of what happened, but she knows that Aunt May's foundation is helping her go to special science camps and advanced math classes." "How much does she know about the gambling addiction?" "She knows I had a sickness that made me make bad choices with money and that I'm getting better with help from doctors. The family therapist says that's age-appropriate information that helps her understand without taking on blame or responsibility." We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching other families visit their loved ones in various stages of recovery. The treatment center felt more hopeful than I'd expected, filled with people working hard to rebuild their lives and relationships. "May," Jessica said finally, "I need to tell you something that I've never admitted to anyone, including my therapists here." I braced myself for another revelation or manipulation. "That night at Thanksgiving, when I found your bank statements, part of me was actually proud of you. Robert left you that money because he saw something special in you that the rest of us never appreciated. Before the desperation took over, before I started calculating how much debt I could pay off, I felt genuine happiness that you'd been recognized for your worth." The admission caught me completely off guard. Really? You were always the smartest person in our family, the most ethical, the most accomplished. You deserved that recognition and that security. My addiction and desperation made me try to steal something that you'd earned through years of hard work and genuine relationships. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, I saw my sister rather than my tormentor. The person who'd celebrated my college graduation, who'd been excited about my first job, who'd bragged to her friends about her sister, the software engineer. "The foundation work I've started," I said carefully, "helps families dealing with workplace safety issues and wrongful death cases. If you continue your recovery successfully, there might be opportunities for you to contribute to that work someday." Jessica's eyes filled with tears. "You'd trust me with something that important to you." "I'd trust your recovery with something that important to me," I corrected. "There's a difference." She nodded, understanding the distinction. "I have 2 more months in this program, then 6 months of outpatient treatment, then ongoing support group participation, probably for the rest of my life. Recovery isn't a destination, it's a daily choice. And if you keep making that daily choice, there will be opportunities to rebuild trust and contribute to meaningful work." As our visiting time came to an end, Jessica stood to leave but turned back one more time. "May, I'm truly sorry for what I put you through. Not just sorry that I got caught, but sorry that I betrayed someone who deserved so much better from the people who claim to love her." "Thank you for saying that," I replied, "and thank you for doing the work to become someone who could mean it." The drive home from the treatment center took me past the house where that nightmarish Thanksgiving had occurred. Mom and Dad still lived there, but our relationship had evolved into something more honest and boundaried. They received assistance from the foundation for legitimate medical and housing needs, but always through supervised channels that prevented manipulation or exploitation. Ruth had become my closest family connection, serving as the foundation's ethics advisor and helping other elderly people recognize and resist financial abuse from relatives. Her wisdom and Robert's foresight had created a new model for family relationships based on mutual respect rather than obligation and guilt. The foundation office where I now worked was located in the same building where Robert and I had collaborated on software development projects. Every day, I helped families navigate the legal and financial challenges of workplace injuries and wrongful death cases, using the skills Robert had taught me and the resources his death had provided. It felt like the most meaningful work of my life, transforming personal tragedy into systematic change that protected other families from the corporate negligence that had killed my mentor. The $10 million that had once threatened to destroy my family relationships was now providing security education and justice for dozens of families who'd faced similar losses. That evening, I called Emma to check on her progress in the gifted science program. Her excitement about marine biology experiments and her plans for college research filled me with hope for the next generation. She was growing up with a much healthier understanding of family relationships, money, and the difference between helping and enabling. "Aunt May," she said as our conversation wound down, "my counselor says that sometimes bad things happen in families that make them stronger if everyone does the hard work to fix them. Do you think our family is getting stronger?" "I think our family is getting healthier," I replied carefully, "and healthy families are definitely stronger than unhealthy ones." "I love you, Aunt May." "I love you too, Emma, and I'm proud of the young woman you're becoming." As I hung up the phone, I realized that Robert's greatest gift hadn't been the money itself, but the wisdom he'd embedded in how that money could be used. By creating systems that rewarded honesty and punished exploitation, he'd given my family a chance to learn better ways of relating to each other and to money. The inheritance that had once threatened to destroy us had ultimately provided the structure for rebuilding relationships based on respect, boundaries, and genuine care, rather than manipulation and entitlement. 2 years after that life-changing Thanksgiving, I stood behind the podium at the National Workplace Safety Conference, looking out at an audience of families who'd been touched by preventable industrial accidents. The Robert Chen Foundation had grown from $1 million emergency fund into a comprehensive advocacy organization that was changing how companies approached worker protection. 3 years ago, I began my keynote speech. My mentor, Robert Chen, died in a chemical explosion that could have been prevented if his company had listened to the safety concerns he'd been raising for months. Today, the foundation established in his memory has helped pass new federal regulations that will save countless lives. In the audience, I could see families who'd received legal support, educational assistance, and advocacy help through the foundation. Their presence reminded me daily that Robert's death had created lasting change that extended far beyond my personal inheritance story. But this foundation represents more than workplace safety reform, I continued. It represents the power of choosing how we respond to tragedy and betrayal. We can let pain make us bitter and isolated, or we can channel that pain into protecting others from similar experiences. After my speech, I was approached by Maria Santos, whose husband had died in a construction accident 6 months earlier. She was holding her young daughter's hand while describing the legal battles she faced with corporate lawyers who wanted to minimize her family's settlement. Ms. Patterson, the foundation's legal advocacy program, saved my family from being cheated out of the compensation we needed for my daughter's education, Maria said. But more than that, it helped me understand that my husband's death meant something. The safety changes implemented at his construction company have already prevented 2 other accidents. These conversations had become the most meaningful part of my work. Each family's story reminded me why Robert had structured the inheritance to create lasting impact rather than temporary relief. Later that afternoon, I returned to my office to find Jessica waiting in the reception area. She'd been clean from gambling for 18 months and had recently completed her paralegal certification through a program the foundation sponsored for family members affected by addiction. "I wanted to share something with you," Jessica said, pulling out an official-looking document. "The state licensing board approved my application to become a certified addiction counselor. I'll be working specifically with families dealing with gambling addiction and financial abuse." The transformation in Jessica was remarkable. The desperate, manipulative person who'd tried to steal my inheritance had been replaced by someone genuinely committed to helping others avoid the mistakes that had nearly destroyed her family. "There's something poetic about you using legal training to help people instead of to exploit them," I observed. "I learned from the best teacher available," Jessica replied. "My own experience of how destructive financial manipulation can be." Emma, now 11 years old, came running into the office with the excitement of someone who'd just made a scientific discovery. She'd spent the day at the Foundation's youth science camp studying marine ecosystems and learning about environmental protection. "Aunt May," We found 3 different species of algae in the pond samples, and our instructor said that algae diversity is an indicator of water quality, which means the ecosystem is healthy. Her enthusiasm reminded me of my own childhood curiosity about science, and I felt grateful that she was growing up in an environment that nurtured her interests, rather than limiting her potential based on gender or family expectations. Emma's already talking about applying for the Foundation's college scholarship program when she's old enough, Jessica said proudly. She wants to study marine biology and environmental protection. By the time she's ready for college, the Foundation should be able to provide full scholarships for students pursuing careers in workplace safety, environmental protection, or social justice, I replied. The Foundation's growth had exceeded even Robert's ambitious plans. Corporate donations, government grants, and investment returns had multiplied the original inheritance into a sustainable organization that would continue helping families for generations. That evening, I drove to Ruth's house for our weekly dinner together. At 91, she remained sharp and engaged, serving as the Foundation's ethics advisor and telling anyone who'd listen about the importance of protecting elderly people from financial exploitation. "You know," Ruth said as we shared a simple meal in her kitchen, "Robert would be amazed by what you've accomplished with his legacy." "I think he'd be amazed by what you accomplished that Thanksgiving night," I replied. "You're the one who documented everything and created the evidence that made justice possible. We all played our parts, but you're the one who chose forgiveness over revenge, healing over bitterness, and service over selfishness." Ruth had become my chosen family in the truest sense, providing the unconditional love and support that my biological family had struggled to offer consistently. Her wisdom and strength had guided me through the most difficult period of my life. As I prepared to leave that evening, Ruth handed me an envelope that looked similar to the ones Robert used to leave for me. "What's this?" "Instructions for the next phase of your life," she said with a mysterious smile. Robert wasn't the only one who planned ahead. I opened the envelope to find a deed transferring ownership of Ruth's house to the Foundation, along with instructions for converting it into a retreat center for families dealing with workplace tragedies and financial exploitation. "Ruth, this is too generous." "It's strategic," she corrected. "This house has seen both the worst and best of family behavior. It should become a place where other families can learn to heal and rebuild trust after traumatic experiences." The gift would complete the Foundation's mission of providing comprehensive support for families facing both legal challenges and relationship repair after workplace tragedies. As I drove home that night, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. The $10 million that had once threatened to destroy my family relationships had become the foundation for work that was more meaningful than anything I'd ever imagined. My phone buzzed with a text message from Tyler, Jessica's son, who was now 14 and thriving in the Foundation's youth leadership program. "Aunt May, I wrote my school essay about how financial trauma can bring families together if everyone does the hard work to heal. My teacher wants to submit it to a national writing contest." His message reminded me that the next generation was learning different lessons about money, family, and trust than the ones that had driven my parents and siblings to attempted theft and manipulation. The Foundation had created a new model for thinking about inheritance and wealth, one based on stewardship rather than ownership, service rather than hoarding, and healing rather than exploitation. But perhaps most importantly, it had taught me that family isn't defined by blood relations or shared genetics, but by mutual respect, genuine care, and the willingness to support each other's growth without expecting anything in return. Robert's inheritance had given me financial security, but his wisdom had given me something more valuable: the knowledge that true wealth comes from using whatever resources you have to make the world a little better for the people who come after you. As I pulled into my driveway, I could see lights on in my home office, where Foundation staff were working late to help a family in Oregon whose father had died in a mining accident. Their dedication to serving others reminded me daily that meaningful work is the best way to honor both loss and gain. And I thought about calling my followers and subscribers to share this story, but realized it was more important to ask them what they thought about family dynamics and financial boundaries. Have you ever experienced family pressure about money or inheritance? How do you think families should handle financial windfalls? What's the difference between helping family members and enabling destructive behavior? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe for more stories about family dynamics, financial boundaries, and personal growth. And please share this with anyone who might benefit from understanding how to protect themselves from financial exploitation while still maintaining loving family relationships. Thank you for listening to this journey of betrayal, healing, and transformation. Remember that sometimes the greatest gift we can give our loved ones is teaching them the difference between healthy support and destructive enabling. The Robert Chen Foundation continues to help families navigate these challenges, proving that even our most painful experiences can become sources of strength and service for others. Until next time, protect your boundaries, honor your values, and never forget that you deserve relationships based on genuine love rather than financial obligation.